They thought age would make me quiet. But time only sharpened me. I remember the day their disrespect settled in my chest like a stone, a dull, heavy certainty. One I pretended not to notice, because mothers often pretend. We soften our voice, we bend our spine, we hush the tremble in our hands. But there comes a moment when silence becomes its own kind of truth. And mine arrived on a late afternoon that smelled of dust, leftover arguments, and cold tea I forgot to drink. They were grown by then, my own children, busy, tired, convinced they understood more than I ever had. Their words no longer carried warmth, they carried distance and judgment. A daughter who rolled her eyes when I spoke, a son who dismissed every memory I tried to share, both whispering complaints when they thought I couldn't hear, both talking about me as if I were a burden someone had carelessly dropped at their feet. I was not fragile. Age had not erased the woman I used to be. But disrespect can make even the strongest bones feel colder. I stood there, listening to the house I raised them in echo with voices that no longer felt like mine. And the room almost seemed to tilt, the way it does when you realize someone has rewritten your story without asking permission. Still, I did not fight them, not that day. Not with words they would only twist. Not with logic they didn't want to understand. I carried their dismissal, the way one carries an old injury. Quietly, but permanently. Then something happened that shifted the air in that house. A sound. Soft. Small. One of the children tugging on my sleeve, asking if I could help tie a shoelace that kept unraveling like a stubborn little ribbon of rebellion. The child looked at me with trust. Pure, unfiltered trust. The kind that adults forget how to offer. The kind that says without speaking, I know you won't fail me. The contrast burned. Their parents' coldness, the child's warmth. And in that tiny moment, something inside me realigned. Not with anger, not with revenge in the loud, destructive sense, but with intention, with clarity. If my own children saw me as small, then I would rise in a way they wouldn't see coming, not to hurt them, but to prove something deeper, something they had forgotten, that a woman who raised a family never loses her power. She just learns to redirect it. I watched the children run around in the living room with the kind of wild joy adults forget how to carry. They still laughed without apology. They still looked at the world like it wanted to welcome them. They still believed love had structure, shape, reliability. And in that belief, I found my new purpose, my quiet vow. I would raise these grandchildren with the strength their parents never allowed themselves to learn. I would guide them with patience, sharpened by experience. I would give them the love that had gone stale in the hands of those who forgot where they came from. Not to teach their parents a lesson with heat or noise, but to leave a legacy whose glow they would have to squint at. A legacy that would speak louder than any argument. A legacy that would remind them who I always was. A grandmother who refused to be erased. A woman who knew how to plant seeds even in soil that had stopped listening. I looked at the children again, Their bright eyes, their small fists clutching toys like future dreams taking shape. And I whispered to myself, this is where my story begins again. Not in confrontation, but in creation. Not in bitterness, but in a fierce, quiet love that knows exactly what it's doing. Their parents might have forgotten my worth, but these children, they saw it without trying. And what they saw, I would grow. Carefully, patiently, fully. The next day, the work began. Tiny lessons wrapped in everyday moments, teaching them how to speak kindly, how to think deeply, how to stay steady in a world that shakes easily, how to hold dignity the way others hold weapons. I became their anchor in ways they didn't yet understand. And while their parents drifted between impatience and neglect, I stood firm, not to replace them, but to strengthen what they had weakened. Some might call it revenge, but it was more refined than that, more elegant. It was a reclamation, a rebuilding, a reminder that love, when wielded with purpose, can shape an entire generation. And every time those small hands reached for me, instead of the ones who dismissed me, I felt the balance of the world tilt just a little, enough for me to stand taller, enough for them to see, eventually, that the woman they underestimated was quietly raising the future they could not control. I learned something powerful in those early days. Respect is not demanded, it is cultivated. But when someone refuses to offer it, you are allowed to redirect your energy toward those who can receive it. I stopped waiting for apologies. I stopped hoping for changed hearts. I stopped sacrificing myself at the altar of their expectations. Instead, I invested my love where it could grow, in the children who saw me clearly, in the next chapter of a story I thought had ended, in the quiet triumph of knowing that influence doesn't disappear with age, it deepens. Their parents believed they were punishing me with distance, but they were only freeing me to shape something better. And with every lesson I taught those little ones, I felt my spirit return to itself, sharper, warmer, wiser. And the stone in my chest, it didn't vanish, but it transformed into something steady, something grounding, something that reminded me that even heartbreak can become a foundation. And that was the day I chose to raise strength from the ashes of disrespect. Some stories break you once, but some break you slowly, over years you didn't know were slipping away. When the grandchildren began spending more time with me, it wasn't because anyone planned it. Life simply rearranged itself, the way seasons shift without asking permission. Their parents were too busy, too distracted, too tangled in the threads of their own disappointments. So the children drifted my way, as if the house remembered who had always held its warmth. They arrived with mismatched backpacks, half-eaten cereal bars, and questions that were too big for their small shoulders. "Grandma, why does Daddy sound angry even when he's not yelling? Grandma, why does Mommy say she's tired before the day even starts? Grandma, does growing up make you sad?" Children don't realize how easily they reveal the cracks in the world around them. They speak the truth before they learn the weight of hiding it. And every truth they dropped into my hands felt like a puzzle piece their parents refused to see. I didn't blame the children. I didn't even blame the adults, though disappointment sometimes pressed against my ribs. Life hardens people in different ways. Some become stone. Some become steam. Some simply break. But I refused to let these little ones inherit the fractures. So I gathered them at the kitchen table, the same table where their parents once spilled juice, homework, and secrets. I spread notebooks across the wood, opened storybooks with worn corners, and laid out a quiet plan. A plan to rebuild the soft parts of them before the world tried to reshape them into something smaller. We began with stories. Not fairy tales, not pretend, but stories with bone and truth. Stories about courage in ordinary moments, kindness as a choice, strength that doesn't raise its voice. They listened deeply, with wide eyes and fingers curled around warm mugs of cocoa. And in those long afternoons, their spirits began to stretch, the way young trees reach for sunlight without knowing they're growing. Still, the house wasn't free of shadows. One evening, their parents arrived at my door earlier than expected, and the tension settled thick in the air. Their arguments were muffled but sharp, like glass being wrapped in cloth. The children heard it. They always heard it. I watched the way their bodies stiffened, the way their small shoulders curled inward, the way their confidence shrank like a flame meeting cold wind. And I knew it was time to teach them something their parents were never taught: how to stay open in a world that closes too fast. The next morning, I kept them home a little longer before school. We sat outside in the garden while the sun was still stretching across the grass. "Look," I told them, pointing to the tallest flower rising above the others, a bold, steady thing, undisturbed by the smaller plants bending beside it. The youngest nodded, tracing a leaf with curious fingers. "So, we can grow, even if people around us don't?" "Yes," I said, letting the truth settle between us like soft morning light. They held on to that, more than I realized. Over the next weeks, small transformations began. The older one started speaking with clarity instead of apology. The middle one began standing straighter, stepping into rooms without shrinking. The youngest discovered laughter again, bright and untangled. I noticed the way they watched me, too, not with dependency, but with understanding. They sensed that I was showing them the parts of strength their parents had forgotten to carry. But not everyone understood the shift. One afternoon, their mother called. Her voice carried the sharpness of someone who fears what she cannot control. "What are you teaching them? Mom, they're getting defiant." I almost laughed, not at her, but at the irony. She mistook confidence for rebellion, firmness for disrespect, self-worth for disobedience. I spoke calmly, as steady as the ground beneath us. "I'm teaching them to know their own voice, to trust their mind, to walk with heart, not fear." She fell silent, a silence that crackled with resentment and confusion. I knew she didn't understand. Not yet, but understanding wasn't my goal. The children were. The next day, the grandchildren returned with stories about school, about speaking up in class, about helping another child who was crying alone, about standing beside a friend who was being talked down to. Each story stitched warmth into the house, a different kind of legacy, one their parents didn't know how to leave behind. And as I watched them, moving through the rooms with new steadiness in their steps, I realized something I hadn't said aloud. I wasn't just raising them. I was correcting a history, quietly rewriting the parts of our family story that had grown twisted. Their parents carried wounds they never tended to, stress they never understood, fear disguised as authority, and emotional distance shaped by years they refused to revisit. But these children, they were the reset, the beginning of a better branch on the family tree. So I pushed forward, gently, consistently, firmly. I taught them to listen before responding, to breathe before reacting, to walk into a room believing they deserve to be there, to hold loyalty the way others hold ambition, to love without becoming naive, to forgive without forgetting what they need to protect. These lessons were small, but they accumulated like steady rainfall. And soon, even the neighbors began to notice how grounded the children were becoming. How did you raise them to be so calm, so thoughtful, so respectful? I smiled the small, quiet smile of someone who knows the answer, but doesn't need the applause. Because this was never about being praised. It was about healing what was broken and showing the world that love offered with wisdom becomes power. Still, the most defining moment came not from teaching, but from witnessing. One evening, their father returned to pick them up. He was tired, impatient, weighed down by the invisible burdens he never learned to put down. The children stood in front of him, unsure, waiting for the tone of his mood. He spoke sharply, rushing them, not looking at them fully. But this time, something shifted. The oldest lifted their chin, not with rebellion, but with steady, measured courage. "Dad, we're getting our shoes. You can speak to us kindly." The room froze. His irritation cracked. He stared at them, startled by the strength he did not teach. And the youngest, the one who used to shrink first, stepped closer to me instead of hiding behind him. In that moment, I saw everything. The past, the present, the future. The transformation taking shape right in front of me. The father opened his mouth to argue, but the words collapsed. He didn't know how to respond to dignity wrapped in softness. He didn't recognize the quiet power standing in front of him because he had never learned to carry his own. When they finally left that night, I stood in the doorway long after the car disappeared. My chest felt full, not with triumph, but with something deeper, a confirmation. They were becoming who they were meant to be, not replicas of their parents, not echoes of old wounds, but their own kind of strong. Not loud, not forceful, not hardened, but steady, loyal, loving in a way that heals instead of hurts. And in all of that, I felt the quiet revenge. Not cruel, not vengeful in the traditional sense, but rooted in the undeniable truth that the greatest response to disrespect is building something beautiful in the very space someone tried to make small. Raising those children taught me that strength can be gentle. It can be thoughtful. It can be shaped in moments that look ordinary to everyone else. I learned that healing sometimes skips a generation, that sometimes the heartbroken raise the healers, that love passed through tired hands can still bloom in new ones. Their parents may never understand why the children became different. Some truths reveal themselves slowly, and some arrive all at once, like a door you didn't know was locked until it suddenly opens. As the months passed, the children grew into themselves with a quiet confidence that made the walls feel brighter. Their laughter had weight again, their conversations stretched longer, and their curiosity became a flame nothing could dim. But growth has a way of drawing shadows toward it. And soon enough, their parents began to notice the changes. Changes they couldn't explain, couldn't guide, and couldn't claim. It began with small comments, little digs disguised as questions. Mom, why do they listen to you more than they listen to us? Why are they suddenly so bold, so opinionated? What exactly are you telling them? I answered gently, always gently. Nothing you wouldn't want them to know. How to think, how to choose, how to carry themselves. But insecurity has sharp edges. And my children, now parents themselves, were cut by their own. One evening, they arrived unannounced. Their voices carried an anxious urgency, as if they had gathered courage in the car and wound it tightly around themselves. They stood in my doorway with folded arms and restless eyes, and the room sensed the shift before I even spoke. "We think you're turning them against us," the mother said, not with anger, but with the weariness of someone convinced she was losing something she never knew how to protect. The father exhaled sharply and looked everywhere but at me. "They don't respond to us anymore. They only listen to you." Their words floated between us like dust caught in sunlight, unsettled, unclear, revealing more than they intended. I felt the children watching from down the hall, their bodies tense with worry. So I stepped outside with their parents, closing the door behind me. Not to hide anything, but to show the children that conflict doesn't need an audience to grow louder. Outside, the evening air held a coolness that steadied me, and I stood there feeling every part of my age and every part of my strength at the same time. "You think I'm turning them against you," I said quietly. "Because they aren't afraid anymore, because they speak differently, because they expect gentleness, because they are finally being seen." The silence that followed had its own heartbeat. Their mother swallowed hard. "I just want them to respect us." I nodded, allowing the truth to rise slowly. Respect is not built on fear, and love is not shaped by volume. The father finally met my eyes. "What are you saying?" I took a breath, not a dramatic one, just enough to steady the words I'd carried for years. "You're raising them with the weight of your own unhealed stories. I am raising them with the lessons your childhoods taught me, not to hurt you, but to protect them." His jaw tightened, but his gaze softened, a contradiction he didn't know how to hide. "You think we're bad parents?" Whispered. "No," I said. "I think you are tired adults who never learned the things you expect from them." The truth didn't land harshly. It simply settled, the way a forgotten truth eventually must. For a moment, no one spoke. Cars passed in the distance, the wind combed through the trees, and the porch light flickered as if listening. Finally, their mother let her shoulders sink. "What are we supposed to do?" It was the first vulnerable question she had asked me in years, and in that softness, I saw a glimpse of the child she used to be. The one who once held my hand when crossing the street, the one who used to run to me for comfort. Learn with them, grow with them, admit when you're hurting, tell them what you never told me. Show them the love you keep hidden beneath all your fears. But they weren't ready to hear all of it. Not then. Not yet. They left shortly after, carrying their confusion like a mirror they didn't want to look into. When I re-entered the house, the grandchildren hurried toward me, anxious and wide-eyed. The oldest asked, "Are they angry at us?" The youngest whispered, "Did we do something wrong?" I knelt down, gathering them close in a loose circle of arms and warmth. "No, you did nothing wrong. Sometimes adults carry storms inside them, and they don't know how to keep the rain from spilling onto the people they love." Their eyes softened, but the worry lingered, and I knew this was another moment to shape gently. So I guided them into the living room and sat with them until their breaths steadied. We talked about boundaries, about communication, about courage that doesn't need to raise its voice, about compassion that doesn't let you disappear. These were big truths for young hearts, but they received them without fear. Children understand emotional language long before adults learn to translate it. Days passed, then weeks, and slowly the tension with their parents became something the children learned to navigate. Not by shrinking, not by fighting, but by standing in their quiet strength. Their mother tried to soften her tone. Their father tried to listen more. It wasn't perfect, but the effort was new, and effort matters. Still, there came a day when the true shift revealed itself. It was a Sunday afternoon, warm and slow, with the kind of sunlight that makes the house hum with calm. The children were in the backyard, building something with sticks and imagination. Their voices carried with a brightness that made my heart steady itself. Then I heard footsteps approaching, heavy, uneven. I turned to see their father standing at the back door, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered but searching. "Can I talk to you?" he asked. I nodded, letting him step into the quiet space beside me. He looked out at his children who were so alive, so grounded, so different from the fearful versions he once raised. After a long pause, he spoke. "Mom, when did they stop listening to me?" His voice cracked, not loudly, but with the fragile sound of a truth finally breaking open. I didn't answer immediately. I let the question breathe. And then I said, "They didn't stop listening. They stopped fearing. And you mistook the difference." He closed his eyes as if the words were both a balm and a bruise. "I don't know how to be better for them," he admitted quietly. "I don't know how to undo what I learned." This was the moment I had waited for, not for revenge, not for victory, but for healing. I placed my hand over his, the same way I did when he was little. You don't need to undo everything. Just begin again. Learn from them. Let them teach you what gentleness looks like. He nodded, slowly, honestly, not as a defeated man, but a father finally awakening. The children noticed him after a moment and ran toward us, full of energy and brightness. He stood still, unsure, but the oldest reached for his hand in a silent offering of hope. And hope is something even wounded adults can hold. I watched them, all of them, standing in the late afternoon light. A fragile, emerging version of family. Not perfect, not healed, but trying. And in that moment, I realized something important. My quiet revenge was never about outshining their parents. It was about creating a generation strong enough to break the cycle. It was about raising children who carried love with clarity and guiding adults back to the softness they had buried. Because sometimes the deepest revenge is repairing what others allowed to break. I learned that healing doesn't always start with understanding. Sometimes it begins with discomfort, with reflection, with the courage to face your own shadows without running. I learned that children grow into mirrors. There comes a moment when a family finally hears its own heartbeat. And in that sound, everyone must decide whether to run or to return. In the months that followed, something subtle began shifting inside the house. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like a room slowly filling with light at dawn, where you don't notice the glow until you realize you can see again. The children continued growing into themselves, steadier, kinder, more rooted. Their questions became deeper, their thoughts more layered, their choices less tangled. I watched them evolve the way seasons change, naturally, predictably, beautifully. But the real transformation, the one I had quietly hoped for, whispered for, waited for, was beginning inside their parents. At first it was small, a softer greeting at the door, a slower tone when asking the children to put their shoes on, small pauses before reacting, moments of breath where there once was only pressure. It wasn't perfect, and I never expected perfection from adults who were still trying to outrun the shadows of their own childhoods. But effort has a sound, and the house had started humming with it. One evening, I invited everyone for dinner, a rare moment of all of us sitting around the same table, the same wooden table that had witnessed decades of stories, storms, and silent prayers whispered into steaming bowls of soup. The children sat between us, their energy soft but bright. Their parents sat across from me, carrying a quiet determination that felt unfamiliar, yet hopeful. Halfway through the meal, the youngest dropped a spoon, and the clatter echoed across the room. Months ago, their father would have barked at the noise, snapped without thinking, let the frustrations spill over. But now, he simply picked up the spoon, wiped it clean, and placed it back on the table. No sigh, no sharpness, just a simple human gesture of patience. The child blinked in surprise, then smiled, and that small smile broke something open in him. Something old, something tired, something ready to let go. But the moment that truly marked the turning point came later that night. After dinner, after dishes, after the children had wandered into the living room to build worlds out of wooden blocks, their mother approached me with a hesitance I recognized, the kind carried by someone who has been strong for too long in all the wrong ways. She stood by the sink, twisting the corner of a dish towel between her fingers. "Mom," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something." I waited, not pushing, not filling the silence, just letting space be space. She took a long breath. "I used to think you judged me for the way I raised them, for the way I reacted, for the way I shut down." Her voice wavered, but she continued. "I realize now you weren't judging me. You were trying to fill the gaps I didn't know how to fill. You were loving them in the places where I was scared to try." Her voice softened even further. "I see it now, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner." The apology surprised me, not because she owed me anything, but because apologies require reflection, and reflection requires courage. I placed the towel aside, letting my hands rest on the counter. "I don't need to apologize," I said. "You were carrying burdens you never named. An unspoken weight becomes behavior." She nodded, swallowing the last edge of her guilt. Then she whispered, "I want to do better, but I don't know how to be the mother they need and the daughter you deserve." That line, that fragile, trembling line, carried the entire weight of her story. Her childhood, her fears, her distance, her longing. And in that moment, I didn't see the woman who had dismissed me, disrespected me, or misunderstood me. I saw the child she used to be, the child who needed gentleness before she learned to hide it. I reached for her hand, warm, nervous, unsteady. I told her, "You don't have to be perfect. No one needs perfect. Just present, just honest, just willing." Her breath shook in relief. And that was the moment her son walked into the kitchen, the oldest child, now standing taller, wiser, calmer. He looked at his mother. She looked at him. And for the first time in years, I saw both of them soften at the same time. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her, not because she asked, not because I encouraged it, but because his heart recognized a moment of rebuilding. Her eyes closed as she held him, as if some long locked door had cracked open inside her chest. Later that night, after they all left, I sat alone in the living room, listening to the faint echoes of the day. And I realized something I hadn't fully understood until then. The strength I gave the children was not replacing their parents. It was guiding their parents home, back to themselves, back to the softness they had misplaced, back to the family they were afraid to believe they still deserved. But healing is not linear, and the next challenge came sooner than I expected. A few days later, the father arrived late to pick up the children. He looked exhausted, weighed down by something heavy in his expression. But when he spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been in years. He said, "I messed up today. I got frustrated. I raised my voice. I walked away instead of explaining." He paused, pressing his thumb into the crease of his hand. Then he said, "And they told me, 'Dad, take a breath. We can talk about it.'" I watched him as he retold the moment, his shock, his embarrassment, and then his unexpected gratitude. He said, "They're changing me." He whispered, "They're changing me in ways I didn't know were possible." And I felt a warmth rise in my chest, not proud, not boastful, but deeply, quietly grateful. This was what I had hoped for, not revenge in the sharp sense, but restoration, transformation, a recalibration of everything that had gone wrong. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the house filled with amber light, the children gathered around me on the couch. The oldest leaned against my shoulder, the middle one sprawled across the floor, drawing constellations on scratch paper, The youngest curled up by my knee, humming softly. "Grandma," the middle one said, "when we grow up, we want to be kind like you, strong like you, and patient like you." Their words settled around me like a warm blanket. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just steady and real. I smiled and held their hands. I told them, all I want is for you to grow into yourselves, into the best version of the person you already are. And as I watched them, these children who were becoming stronger than the wounds they were born into, I felt a truth settle deep inside me. The revenge was never about proving their parents wrong. It was never about winning. It was never about control. It was about creating people who would carry love with clarity, who would stand in rooms without shrinking, who would break cycles without breaking themselves. It was about raising a future where gentleness was not mistaken for weakness, and strength was not confused with volume. It was about giving the next generation the tools the last one didn't know how to use. I learned that healing a family takes more than guidance. It takes courage. It takes patience. It takes the willingness to love even when you've been overlooked, even when you've been dismissed, even when your efforts are misunderstood. But more than anything, they asked me once if I ever regretted staying quiet while they mocked me. I told them silence is not surrender, it is strategy. You know, there comes a season in every life when the mirror stops telling you who you are and starts telling you who you've become. And by the time I reached that season, my hair had silvered, my joints had stiffened, and the world believed I was winding down like an old clock losing its rhythm. But inside, I was sharpening. I was refining. I was planting. Every night, after the house settled into its hush, I would sit with my own heartbeat, steady, certain, and I would think about everything I had endured, every insult disguised as a joke, every dismissal dressed up as advice. Every time they told me my dreams were too big for my age, or my hands were too tired, or my wisdom was outdated. They thought I was shrinking, but I was studying. I was watching how bitterness eats a person from the inside, and I refused to taste it. My revenge was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be lasting. One evening, the grown children finally returned, the ones who once rolled their eyes at me, the ones who called me dramatic when I warned them their choices would echo in their children's hearts. They walked through my doorway, trying to claim authority they had never earned. Their voices were sharp. Their impatience was louder than their footsteps. They demanded to know why the grandchildren listened to me more than them. I looked at their cold faces, and I thought about the days I carried all their weight alone, feeding them, holding them, believing in them even when they spat their doubt right back at me. And I answered them with quiet precision, because quiet is sharper than anger. I didn't teach your children to choose me over you. I taught them to choose love over fear, respect over noise, kindness over ego. If they find that in me, then ask yourselves why they don't find it in you. The room froze. The air thickened around their unspoken defensiveness. And for the first time, they saw me not as background, not as burden, but as the center of every seed they had taken for granted. They tried to argue. Of course they did. But the grandchildren stepped forward before I had to speak again. One placed a hand on my shoulder, another moved in front of me, and the youngest stared at their parents with a bravery I once only prayed they would grow into. One said, "Grandma raised us." Another added, "You visited." The youngest whispered, "You judged, but she showed us how to live." The truth fell like a soft hammer, not violent, not loud, just undeniable. In that moment, the adults who once disrespected me finally tasted the consequence of their own neglect. And I didn't gloat. I didn't celebrate. I simply let the truth breathe. Because sometimes revenge is not a strike. Sometimes it is a mirror. They left that night with steps heavier than when they came. They didn't yell. They didn't defend themselves. They didn't blame me. They just realized what they had lost and what their children had gained. And as the door closed, soft like a sigh, my grandson asked me, "Grandma, did you win?" I looked at all of them, standing there like a small village I had built with gentle hands and steady strength. I felt the quiet power rising in me like a warm tide. "No," I said, "I didn't win." I stepped closer and tucked a strand of hair behind the youngest one's ear. "We won." Life has taught me many lessons, but the clearest one is this. Revenge is not about proving someone wrong. It is about proving something right. I didn't raise them to hurt their parents. I raised them to heal the wounds their parents never dealt with. I raised them to see the world without the fog of pride. I raised them to be strong without cruelty, steady without emptiness, loving without fear. And if their parents feel the sting of that truth, then that sting belongs to the life they built, not to me. My hands stayed clean, my heart stayed whole, my strength stayed quiet, but my legacy roars through them every day. In the end, the sweetest triumph is raising those who will never become the people who once tried to break you. And if you're still here, stay close, because the next story is already rising in the quiet. Another life, another wound, another triumph waiting to unfold. So keep your heart open for the next chapter. If this story held you for even a moment, tap the like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Your presence keeps these stories alive.